Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this week's seminar of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice. My name is Andreas Bieler, and I'm one of the co-directors of this independent research center. And it's my particular pleasure to be tonight's chair and to welcome our speaker, Katia Valenzuela Fuentes. Now, Katia is well known to CSSGJ. Yes, she's done her PhD at the University of Nottingham and was an active participant in the center at the time. Yeah, we just checked on that, Katia. It's in 2017, so actually quite a few years ago. And already back then, you did work on autonomist Marxist analysis of these kind of autonomist developments from below, and comparing back at the time community in Mexico with developments in Chile. And so it's particularly excellent to have you at this moment in time with us, yeah, when we just had that referendum in Chile, and very difficult to understand for people from the outside why it was not successful in a way, yeah, following on from this novel constitution, very progressive constitution. So it will be interesting to hear what you can report on that. But before I hand over to you, some more formal kind of words of introduction. Yeah, Katia is assistant professor at the School of Sociology, Universidad de Concepción in Chile, and researcher from the Center of Sustainable Urban Development. She's currently leading the research project called Popular and Community Struggles and Systemic Crisis in Contemporary Chile. Just what we've been talking about, funded by the Chilean National Agency of Research. This project seeks to understand the politics from below that emerged in Chile after the October uprising in 2019. In addition, she has committed to situated research, undertaking participatory action research project with movements and communities from the area of Concepción, Chile. Her research interests include social movements, political sociology, and critical epistemologies. Katia, we do it as we did back when you were still here at Nottingham. Yeah, you will have about 35 to 40 minutes for your presentation, leaving us with a further 40 minutes then for discussion, debates, question, answers. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Andreas. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. It's my pleasure to be joining you today. As Sandra said, I joined you with joy because the University of Nottingham was my home for more than 4 years. So I'm very grateful for CSSGJ as well, which supported me for my research as well when I did my PhD there. So very happy to join you today. And yeah, about what you were saying about this not really knowing how to understand what's been going on in Chile for people from other countries, I don't think it's very clear to understand for us Chileans. So I think we are somehow equal in that sense. But yeah, so I guess it's a series of recent events, and it's taking a little bit of time for us also to process what's been going on in Chile in the past few months. So I'm going to share with you today some findings and reflections that I've been putting together from some current research projects, but also from some research projects that I've been doing in the last 4 years, I will say, after I came back to Chile. And especially my focus is about the October uprising in 2019. It's impossible to understand what's going on today in Chile if we don't go back to 2019. I mean, this is of course, history plays an important role in how we understand the current political situation in Chile. And for those who probably you are aware, or you know a little bit of or more or a lot, I don't know, about what happened in Chile in 2019, in October 2019. Specifically on the 18th of October, because of metro hiking in the prices of the metro price, there was an uprising that initially was started by secondary students, but then it quickly spread towards the entire Chilean society, not only Santiago, because this started in the capital because of the increase of the fare of metro, but then that was only the beginning of a growing critique of the entire neoliberal project in Chile. So that was very clear from all the shouts in the streets, people screaming, we want the end of privatized education, of privatized healthcare, of privatized pension schemes. So at the end, there was this strong critique of the entire neoliberal project, the commodification of life, and structural inequality, which was something that we were seeing constantly developing over the decades in Chile. And interestingly, this critique, refusal of all these expressions of neoliberalization came together with this distrust in electoral representative politics. So that was something that I was studying before the uprising, kind of looking at how since 2011 in Chile, with the student movement, there was this growing wave of movements which were trying to move beyond the institutional channels of politics. And this was something that was very clear in 2019, where people in the streets or in the kind of new organizations emerging, they were very clear and very explicit that they didn't want these actors as mediators of the crisis, such as political parties and even unions, representatives, and so on. So there was this disenchantment with representative and electoral politics. This trust that was already present in the past. It's not that it happened only in 2019. It was something that has been built in the past decades as well. But one of the things that I believe it's important to stress when we talk about what happened in 2019 in Chile is that this is not a spontaneous thing that happened just like one day in October. We suddenly took onto the streets and demanded the end of inequality and of neoliberal policies. The Chile since decades ago, but if we go just to the last 2 decades, we've been developing a history of local and not only local and national struggles and social movements, moving from the students' movements to the feminist waves of the struggles that I think one of the most powerful ones was the one that we had in 2019, challenging the entire educational system and the sexist and patriarchal roots of the educational systems, from secondary schools to the higher education system. But also, of course, this idea of the historical struggle of Mapuche communities, in our indigenous peoples in the south of Chile. Also, they had this important legacy in the story of resistance in Chile. And in the last decade, this emergence of social environmental movements fighting very, very strongly against extractive projects and corporate projects of mining, forestry, and so on. And so because Chile has become a sacrifice zone, so it's like natural to have the consequence of social environmental movements getting stronger to fight that side of capitalist accumulation, the fight for defending the natural commons in Chile in this case. So in the past decade, we've seen like this, and for me it's very interesting because when I was doing my PhD, I never looked at the anti-colonial critique because it was not that strong. But when I came back to Chile, I realized that all these movements, they have make much more sophisticated their critique. They're much more integral. Their critique to the system is not only an anti-capitalist critique, it's also an anti-patriarchal critique. So the feminist wave kind of shifted as well the movements and started putting care, for example, and all the anti-patriarchal agenda within movements. Of course, this critique of the exploitation of nature as well, with this critique of extractive model of development, but also this anti-colonial critique. So kind of bringing together and embracing our indigenous cosmologies, bringing that back as well into the movements, even urban movements, lives. So this is the previous stage of the 2019 uprising. Super important for me to put a bit of history and context of what happened in 2019. Because all these movements, all the legacy of these movements somehow shaped what happened in October 2019. And one of the things that I believe it's very, very important is to see how all this refusal was channeled towards different structures of oppression. So I don't know if you heard or saw in the TV, or I don't know if it happened there in England, but we had this within the period of the uprising, we have like this moment period from October to January, February 2020, because then the pandemic came, and as you know, everything changed. But during that period, we also had this amazing performance that this Chilean feminist collective kind of displayed in the streets, and that was followed by several women's groups across the world. So Las Tesis, so it's like a rapist in your way, basically, where we were all women went onto the streets and did a public statement against patriarchal oppression, and that came together with this critique towards the neoliberal policies, but also that this is interesting in the kind of more intense moments of protest in Chile. The shopping centers were targeted as well. So the big American type of shopping centers we have in Chile were targeted by demonstrators, and with a lot of anger and violence towards the shopping centers, towards the buildings. And so as a sociologist, I will say, well, like what was being targeted there? I believe capital was being targeted as like shopping center as the symbol of capitalism. But not only that, so in your right corner, you see this kind of the Conqueror's statue in my city. This is in Concepcion, being completely destroyed by, that was, I don't know if 1,000, but at least hundreds of demonstrators, all coming together to taking down this statue. And then interestingly, they took it and then move it to this statue of one of the leaders of Mapuche resistance, which is also in that square. So it was like and for me, this is one of the most symbolic, one of the symbols of this anti-colonial critique that I failed to see before, 5-6 years ago in the analysis. And it's something that happened as well. And interestingly, some of these phrases that were very popular in Argentina in 2001, the crisis, or be one of the major Argentinian crises, and that was stolen from Mexicans as well a couple of years ago. And one of, I think it was during the Ayotzinapa crisis, the students who were disappeared and murdered, that was taken from Chile as well. So they may all leave, basically. So amongst all of these, we also had this critique of the state. So the state was not, it was very confusing at that moment, because the demands were not necessarily being targeted to, or being delivered to the state. It's like they must all leave. I mean, all the politicians, they really are not solving anything. So that was the energy during the first months of the uprising, the first weeks of the uprising. But the demonstrations and the kind of the politics, this, I will say, politics in the streets, the demonstration and the protest were not the only expressions of this uprising. And I think this is, for me, what I've been focusing the most, because I'm interested in social movements, of course. One of the things that emerged after the uprising, and that it was fascinating, and I think Andreas, who read my thesis back in 2017, will understand, because I was studying back then about these autonomous collectives that were claiming for horizontality, for an anti-hierarchical politics, but they were very, I will say, they will be constantly in the margins of politics, not very, there were not many autonomous collectives by then. It was a growing tendency, but there was definitely not like mainstream politics, or not that big. But what happened in 2019, interestingly, is that this type of politics suddenly grew at a level that it was almost impossible to believe. So all these autonomous politics suddenly spread into hundreds of neighborhoods. And the organizational form that took that politics was the form of the local assemblies, interestingly, very similar to the Argentinian case in 2001. So the local assemblies was the most relevant organizational form during the October uprising. What happened immediately after a couple of days of the protests? People in their neighborhoods, because we were confined to stay in our neighborhoods, because immediately the government sent the military forces onto the streets, we didn't have any chance to move. There were no public transportation, military forces were all around, so we had no option but to organize in our neighborhoods. And I talk about we because I do militant research, and I speak as well about my own experience, because of course I was part of the my local assembly in my neighborhood. And one of the features that some of the features that these local assemblies took was horizontality. So all these assemblies were gathered in circles, and there was this almost as like a collective legacy of horizontal organizing. So people knew from the very beginning that they didn't want to have a big leader or someone who was going to represent them. So it was like it was coming from people's experiences, but it was super normal to take this horizontal way of organizing with spokespersons and commissions and small groups where they were working in particular issues. Autonomy as a very key principle as well of these local assemblies. So they refused to be co-opted by electoral or political parties, and they claimed their autonomy from these other types of organizations. This became spaces for participatory spaces for grassroots organizing. So in the places where assemblies were created, the focus was not only in organizing protest and demonstration, which was an important role played by local assemblies, but also in trying to build new neighborhoods, new neighbors relationships. So trying to recreate community bonds that were broken by neoliberalism and by neoliberal subjectivities. So these assemblies became these spaces for popular education, because people started to study what was happening at the political level and how we could imagine a different society and a different Chile. And that was going on all across the main cities, and not only the main cities, all across the cities of the country. In the rural areas happened as well, but with less strength, because we have also the countryside, it's much more conservative. They are much more conservative, probably because of the legacy of the Chilean history, and you didn't see that as powerful assemblies in rural areas. But in urban areas, which is most of the country anyway, in terms of population, we had this form of organization spread everywhere from north to south in Chile. So to give a little bit of context, so while the response from below to this crisis, this political crisis we had in 2019, was the protests and demonstrations, with millions of people onto the streets, and all these experiments of local organizing, such as the local assemblies, the response from above was violence and repression. Very, very. I'll share with you some facts and numbers from that. But also, most importantly, and I think for me it's important to give all this context, because this agreement for peace and new constitution that happened in 2019 in November, in that photo you can see our current president, so Gabriel Boric to the right, and he signed that agreement, which was very criticized by social movements and people who were fighting, because this agreement basically set up the ways in which this new constitutional process was going to happen, and with rules that were defined by the same political actors that civil society or the communities, or whatever we want to call it, were criticizing, without engaging or without involving the people who were fighting in the streets. So it was an agreement created by all the political actors, from right to progressive parties, and they came with this agreement for peace and new constitution that set up and prepared the path to what happened next in Chile in terms of the political path that we've been following. Just to give you an idea of what happened in 2019 as well, in terms of how the fear from having, well, military forces and police into the streets, somehow the fear of the dictatorship came back to several people, and the impact of violence into the people was very, very shocking for us, and easily forgotten, and 32 people died as a consequence of state violence. More than 400 people suffered from eye mutilation and eye trauma. More than 11,000 people were detained. More than 2,500 were imprisoned. several of these people remained imprisoned for a couple of years during the pandemic, and we had thousands of victims of police violence. So that was happening at the moment that this agreement was signed, and many analyses claimed that this was necessary to end this level of violence. They would claim that this was an agreement that was needed for this violence to end. And what happened with this path, this agreement for peace and new constitution, is that this somehow put tension into the local assemblies and all these organizations that were sustaining the struggle, because some assemblies decided to stay pursuing the community path. So they decided to stay working at the kind of neighborhood level and trying to open all these spaces for reclaiming public space, recreating community bonds, making all this kind of creative process of rebuilding trust amongst the community and distrusting the institutional path. But on the other hand, some assemblies and activists being involved in these assemblies decided that this path that this agreement for peace and new constitution opened, we needed to take advantage of that. So some activists decided to pursue this new path and to become representatives in the creation of this new constitution. So that I would call it the institutional path. And people from some assemblies, they decided to elect candidates for going and becoming representatives of the constitutional body that was approved and created. And what happened then? So I think it's important. I'm usually focused on the kind of this politics, what I call politics from below, but it's so important to understand this in context. In October 2020, we had the first referendum where 78%, like most of the people, voted yes to change Pinochet's constitution, like the current constitution, which was created during the dictatorship. And then we have the elections in May 2021, where we had the victory of left-leaning parties and independents for becoming constitutional conventions members. So we seem to be having at that point like this very progressive wave of politics in Chile, then supported by the win of the left-wing candidate Gabriel Boric, which is our current president, but also keeping in mind that the far-right candidate Cast, he also got a lot of percentage of support, 44% of percentage as well. Then we had the second round in December, and Boric wins the elections. And then we had the recent referendum now in September 2022, so only a month ago, to approve or reject the new constitution. And we had that 62% of Chileans, because this is an interesting change and as well and shift, because this referendum was mandatory, whereas all the other elections have a voluntary character. So not all Chileans voted in the previous elections. And this one, which was mandatory, there was a 62% of people who rejected the new constitution. So this is where we are right now in terms of the kind of all the process that we've been through, kind of, I would say, the institutional path. And what has happened as well in terms of the movements is that several leaders of important movements, such as, for example, that's a woman I put in that photo. She was like very important leader and activist of housing, of one of the most important housing movements in Santiago, in Chile. And now she joined the government. And several local activists who were very important, very key actors during the assemblies constitutions, in these local assemblies processes. They became constitutional conventions members, so they became part of this group of people who were democratically elected to write this new constitutional draft. So on the one hand, we had these moves within politics, but on the other hand, we have some movements and assemblies which decided to stay away from all this institutional path going on and to keep distrusting it and making very clear concerns about all the energy that was being taken away to put into the constitutional process instead of placing that energy into this grassroots community work that was needed as well. All this in a context of global pandemic and the big impacts that had in the finances of people, and people kept starting to protest for the lack of food in their homes. So there was like this also economic crisis going on during the pandemic, and I don't see an homogeneous context. So we had this divide in politics in the past years within the movement, social movements, you know, from some sectors that decided to join like this institutional path, and some sectors that look at it with distrust. And in the past months, we had like this very, very intense campaigns. The campaign for approving the new constitution. So many sectors joined to campaign for approving the new constitution, and the campaign for rejecting it was not only led by the right-wing parties, but also by so-called center parties like the Christians, Democrats in Chile, and so people from center, also some of them so-called center-left government parties, they also joined the rejection of the new draft, of constitutional draft. But while all this energy was going on, can you give me an update of how much time do I have left?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem, Katia. You still got a good 10 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So I think it will be nice I'm sure you have questions about the referendum, because it's like the most pressing issue right now, but I want to move and go a little bit deeper into what's not being what is not the focus of the analysis in Chile. And it's that while all these big campaigns were happening for approving and rejecting new constitution, there was this network of movements that I would say grassroots movements from below, which remained active since the 2019 uprising. Some of them were created even before, but that definitely got they increased during the 2019 uprising, and then they had, of course, they were weakened with the pandemic and with the referendum process as well, because many people who played very important roles in these movements, they moved to the institutional process. But many movements remain in these local spheres, such as the local assemblies, but also during the pandemic, from the beginning of the pandemic, what happened, and which is, I think, very, very interesting, because it recreated the community kitchens that were very important in the fight for the dictatorship. Because during the dictatorship, we had like these huge economic crisis. And this happened again with the pandemic. So in these disadvantaged neighborhoods, it was very common for people to organize around food. So they started creating these community kitchens to provide meals for their neighbors. And this is something that still remains in some parts of Chile. But also the co-ops movement, which is, I think, in the case of Chile, it's not necessarily tied to this more formal type of cooperative or cooperativism that we understand in Europe, for example. Here is very much self-managed, non-institutional type of organizations, and we started seeing this growing of food co-ops, workers co-ops, and networks of local economies to deal as well with the economic crisis. The socio-environmental movements, they have remained important in the movements, I will say, map in Chile. And all these several collectives that have spread since the uprising and have played more, I think, important roles in terms of media, for example, of feminisms, or in the case of just trying to deal with the consequences of the state violence, human rights collectives or collectives campaigns focus on seeking freedom for political prisoners after the 2019 uprising. So all these movements from the research I've been doing, they seem to share some features, and some of the features are common to what I studied in 2017, but with less cases. Definitely there were less movements with these features. Now it seems to spread across the map of political mobilization or of social movements in Chile. So politics of care, so this legacy of feminisms, of looking after the spaces where we are organizing. We're not only comrades, we are friends, we have to look after each other. This was very clear during the uprising, where we had to deal with state violence. So it was like, we definitely need to care for each other. In terms of organizational structures, horizontality, or the political stance, autonomy as a pivotal principle, assembly-based politics, like features that are shared among these groups. And this is something new, that it's a very interesting concept, territorial sovereignty, which is like, it's very, I think, it's a concept that I never, like, it was in my mind at all, but this is some concept that started happening from socio-environmental movements, and it's been also borrowed, I think, by other movements. It's basically it means to demand the capacity of peoples to decide how they want to live in their neighborhoods. So reclaiming the capacity of self-determination, so totally radical democracy at a discursive level. So this has been happening all through this period of time, where I show you all this kind of timeline of what was going on at the institutional level. This has been going on at the underground level. And I think, and for me, and for the work I do, I think making this visible, it's a political task. It's a role that needs to be, I mean, I think it's important to show that this has been going on at the same time that we've been going through all this institutional process. Because I'm gonna skip this, because this is details, but interesting, but I want to make good use of my time. Because what we've been experiencing, we've been experiencing now, like this general feeling after the defeat of the new constitutional draft, it seems to be very, very in the air, this feeling of hopelessness, of frustration, of feeling of being defeated, and this blaming mode, I will call, like, who is to blame? So this has remained during all these months. It's like in social media, for example. So some movements blaming this, some other blaming this other. So who are to blame? And this is the moment where we are now. And it can be easily concluded that we all failed, you know, and that all this process that I've been telling you was for nothing, you know. However, I try to put so much energy and attention to this, what I'm showing you now in the Zoom, you know, in the screen. It's like, because along all this institutional path, we've seen this growing, increasing movements that have developed this incredible capacity of mixing the critique of structures of oppression, getting all together, feminisms, getting into the main principles of movements. So that's what I say, that effective politics became an important thing of these movements. This idea that the personal is political, therefore we have to politicize everyday life, human and non-human, and care at the core of activism, something unbelievable for, I don't know, traditional unions, I don't know, activism or our past activism that was not a thing. And now it is a thing. It's super important, all this awareness of protecting natural commons, very tied with this idea of embracing ancestral roots and buen vivir, this idea of living well, this legacy of our indigenous peoples. And all of this has been happening at the same time during these years. And the streets, and now that we are, I think, finally coming to this moment where we have more freedom. In Chile, we had this very, very like difficult pandemic regulations. So we were not allowed to be out without masks, and gatherings were forbidden for a long time. So it was, we finally see this year, now this year, as the year where we are coming back to the streets. And this started to happen last year, despite the government's regulations, but we've been seeing constantly these activities seeking to take over public spaces, and through alternative economies, community markets, grassroots arts activities, popular education. And I will say that this anti-capitalist principle is expressed in these affirmative practices of power to do, in terms of John Holloway. So it's like we are trying to deal differently with our basic needs. In this case, it's like how we survive, you know, and how we care for each other. So when I come back now to this moment, after the referendum, one of this is very recent. So I told Andres, like, I don't think I have like much, because I think we've been processing very slowly what's going on in Chile right now. But one of the, I would say, intuitions that I could share with you is that when all the energy was placed in the constitutional process, no energy was left for local struggles and creative community projects. So in these areas where they decided to bring a candidate for becoming a conventional member for the constitutional writing of this draft, they were drained by the process, and they left the grassroots work. It's impossible for human energy. It's just like, oh, you do this or you do that. It was impossible to find balance between those two paths. And those are the areas where there is this uncertainty and this feeling of frustration and hopelessness and of defeat, basically. However, I believe from what I've been seeing now that hope persists in places where grassroots organizing continued, but then the question of scale remains. So, which is always a question. So, okay, this is great, but I mean, this is still at the micro level. We have not achieved anything. We haven't not achieved big changes. And that's the question that will remain. And I think we will not solve because I think it depends also from our political standpoints. And yeah, so just to end, what I can say is that the October uprising in Chile, what led to this exponential growing of social movements and organized collectives. This energy declined with the pandemic and the institutional political turn. That's an hypothesis I have, but I kind of working this year with this new project, and I think that's something that an hypothesis that I will sustain. When I say the seeds of October, I say that this process was a seedbed for the strengthening of territorialized, so very local, community-based, effective, horizontal political subjectivities that definitely clashed with the liberal model of citizenship. So this is nothing to do with this liberal Western model of citizenship. The defeat of the institutional path is important to analyze, but it's key to explore the persistence of grassroots collectives, usually rendered invisible by mainstream academia and politics. That's why I've been insisting in bringing all this, the development of these other collective experiences that have been remaining invisible as usual, but they've been sustaining hope among communities. Without this, the hopeless state would be even stronger, I think. And yeah, so just I'll leave it there, and then we open for questions if you want.
Fantastic. Many thanks, Katia. That was really excellent overview of the developments, but also very nicely linked back to kind of theoretical issues of how resistance can be organized, and perhaps also the kind of fragmentation between the institutional path and continuing or focusing on strengthening these autonomous experience as concrete alternatives.